Walter Briggs, a 79-year-old retired sergeant, faces a crushing blow when New Liberty Bank freezes his pension due to a system error. Desperate for funds to buy his wife Elaine's critical medication, he's met with indifference from teller Travis and a useless pamphlet. As hope fades, Walter recalls a long-forgotten contact, Graham Kesler, now the bank's CEO. One call sparks a storm. Kesler arrives, furious, demanding answers. The tension peaks as he confronts the manager, hinting at a deeper systemic failure. Will Walter's quiet dignity prevail, or will bureaucracy win? The resolution hangs in the balance. If Walter's story touched you, join us in amplifying veterans' voices. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spark change. Comment your thoughts. How can systems better serve those who served us? Support our channel to uncover more stories that inspire action and remind us of our shared humanity. Walter Briggs stood at the counter of New Liberty Bank, his gnarled hands gripping the edge as if anchoring himself against a storm. At 79, his frame was still sturdy, though slightly stooped, a testament to decades of discipline etched into his bones. His weathered face, lined with the quiet scars of a life spent in service, betrayed a flicker of frustration as he leaned forward. The teller, a young woman with a distracted air, barely glanced up from her screen. Her voice was flat, mechanical, as she delivered the blow. A temporary hold on his account due to internal security protocols, rendering his freshly deposited pension untouchable. No transactions could be processed, she said, sliding a glossy, useless pamphlet across the counter like it was supposed to solve something. Walter's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a heavy, sinking dread. That pension wasn't just money, it was Elaine's lifeline, the means to pay for the medications that kept his wife of 42 years breathing through the fog of advanced COPD. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay even. Security protocols on a pension, he asked, the words carrying the weight of disbelief and a lifetime of keeping calm under pressure. The teller offered no answer, only a shrug that felt like a dismissal. Walter retreated to a bench in the bank's lobby, the pamphlet crumpled in his fist. He sat there defeated, his mind churning through the implications. Elaine's oxygen tanks needed refilling soon, and the pharmacy wouldn't wait. Every dollar of his pension was accounted for: rent, electricity, medications, groceries in that exact order. There was no cushion, no room for error. He'd built his life on precision, on making do with less, and now this faceless protocol was unraveling it all. His thoughts drifted to Elaine, her frail form tucked into their second-hand armchair at home, her breath shallow but steady, her trust in him absolute. He felt the sting of helplessness, a rare and bitter sensation for a man who had spent his life solving problems in war zones, far from the comforts of home. The lobby's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and he stared at the tile floor, searching for a plan, a next step, something to anchor him as the world tilted off its axis. Then the glass doors swung open with a force that cut through the hum of the bank. A man in a dark suit stormed in, his presence sharp and commanding, like a blade slicing through the stale air. Graham Kesler, the CEO of New Liberty Bank, moved with a fury that seemed to pull the room into his orbit. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Walter's for a brief, electric moment before he strode toward the manager's office without a word. The lobby fell silent, the tellers frozen, the air thick with unspoken questions. Walter didn't know who this man was, but he felt the shift, the way a soldier senses a change in the wind before a storm. He sat straighter, his hands clasped tightly, his mind racing with a mix of hope and wariness. For the first time that morning, he felt seen. Walter Briggs was not a man who sought attention. He didn't wear his past like a badge, didn't flaunt his 30 years in the U.S. Army or the quiet heroism of his service. He'd spent most of those years in the shadows of combat zones, managing logistics lines that kept troops fed, fueled, and armed, work that never made headlines but was the backbone of every mission. He rose to senior master sergeant not out of ambition, but because others trusted his steady hand, his ability to cut through camp with calm precision. His pride wasn't in titles or medals, but in the knowledge that he'd done his job well, without ego or complaint. Now, in the twilight of his life, He lived modestly in a one-bedroom apartment just outside town. The beige walls and worn furniture held no pretense, only the quiet dignity of a space kept clean and orderly. The kitchen floor creaked, the coffee pot was stained from years of use, but it was theirs, his and Elaine's, paid for with the same meticulous care he'd applied to every aspect of their life together. Elaine was his anchor, his reason for rising each morning at 5:30, long after the army had released him. Her illness had transformed their days into a delicate dance of routines, medications measured out with precision, oxygen tanks checked and rechecked, doctor's appointments scheduled like military operations. Walter never faltered, never let the weight of it show. He adjusted as he always had because that's what soldiers do. He clipped coupons, scoured pharmacy flyers for discounts, and bought used books from thrift stores to keep his mind sharp without the expense of cable. His pension was stretched thin, every cent allocated with the care of a quartermaster balancing supplies in a war zone. He tracked their expenses on graph paper, each line drawn with a ruler, each number penciled in with deliberate clarity. It wasn't about pride in wealth, but in stewardship, in making sure Elaine had what she needed to face another day. In their small community, Walter was a quiet figure, his veteran status unknown to most. He didn't wear caps emblazoned with his unit or pin his jacket with service ribbons. His dignity was internal, carried in the way he held himself, upright, purposeful, unassuming. A nod of thanks for a held door, a faint smile when asked about his past, and a simple "just did my part" were all he offered. That humility made the bank's cold dismissal cut deeper. It wasn't just the frozen account or the teller's indifference. It was the sense that his life's work, his sacrifices, his careful planning had been reduced to a bureaucratic glitch. For a man who had built his existence on order and duty, the absence of a clear path forward was a quiet devastation. He sat on that bench, the weight of it pressing against his chest, wondering how he'd face Elaine with nothing but a useless pamphlet in his hand. The first Tuesday of every month was sacred, a ritual unchanged for years. Rain or shine, Walter walked the familiar path from their apartment to the new Liberty Bank, nestled unassumingly between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. The routine was his lifeline, a thread of normalcy in a life shaped by discipline. Today, though, that thread had snapped. As he sat in the lobby, the CEO's sudden arrival stirred something in him. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or the instinct to brace for whatever came next. Walter didn't know what Graham Kesler's presence meant, but he felt the weight of it, the possibility that this moment could shift the course of his day, his life, his promise to Elaine. He tightened his grip on the crumpled pamphlet, his resolve hardening. Whatever happened next, he'd face it as he always had, with quiet strength ready to adapt. Walter's mornings followed a rhythm as steady as a metronome, carved into his bones by years of discipline. He didn't need a calendar app or a smartphone buzzing reminders. His internal clock was sharper than any gadget. At precisely 7:02 a.m., his Army pension hit his account, a quiet confirmation of a life spent serving. By 9 he'd be at New Liberty Bank, standing at the counter to withdraw exactly $400. No more, no less. It was a ritual born of necessity, not greed. That money covered the essentials: groceries to keep their pantry stocked, co-pays for Elaine's mounting prescriptions, and a small buffer of cash for the unexpected. Walter wasn't a man swayed by whims or flashy temptations. He didn't trust credit cards or mobile apps, not out of ignorance. He understood technology well enough. But because he'd seen systems crash, data vanish, and promises break. A crisp $20 bill in his wallet carried a weight of certainty that no glowing screen could match. It was tangible, real, like the life he and Elaine had built together. That morning, though, felt heavier than most. Walter slipped on his olive green field jacket, zipping it halfway as always, the fabric worn but sturdy, much like himself. In his chest pocket, a small notepad held a neatly penciled list of errands: milk, eggs, bread, and, most crucially, Elaine's new inhaler. The night before had been rough. Elaine's breathing had grown shallow, each inhale a labored whistle that pierced Walter's heart. Her advanced lung disease had tightened its grip over the years, and the specialist's latest prescription wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline. Walter didn't voice the worry gnawing at him, but it sat heavy in his chest as he stepped out into the crisp morning air. This bank visit wasn't just routine, it was urgent. Inside New Liberty Bank, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted him, a small comfort in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. Walter approached the counter, expecting Margaret, the teller in her 50s, whose warm smile and questions about Elaine always made the transaction feel human. But Margaret wasn't there. Instead, a young man stood behind the counter, his posture rigid, his face all sharp angles and detachment. His name tag read Travis. Walter offered a polite nod, sliding his withdrawal slip and ID across the polished surface. "Morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to withdraw $400 from my account." Travis didn't look up. His fingers were already clicking away at the keyboard, his eyes fixed on the screen as if Walter were just another task to process. A faint escaped him, followed by a frown. "Looks like there's a temporary hold on your account, sir," he said, his tone flat, almost mechanical. Walter's spine stiffened, but he kept his composure. "A hold? Boat?" he repeated, his voice steady despite the flicker of unease in his gut. "My pension came in this morning, same as it has for years." "Yes, sir, I see the deposit," Travis replied, still not meeting Walter's gaze. "But the system flagged it for an automatic security hold. Could be routine, maybe part of last night's processing update." His words were clipped, like he was reading from a script he didn't care to understand. Walter blinked, processing the information. "What does that mean? I can't access my money?" "Not until the hold clears," Travis said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It's part of our fraud prevention protocols. Nothing I can override here." He reached under the counter and slid a glossy trifold pamphlet toward Walter, the customer service number printed in tiny font on the back. "You can call this line. They might explain more." Walter stared at the pamphlet, its polished design mocking the gravity of his situation. His fingers tightened on the counter's edge, the wood cool against his calloused hands. He wasn't prone to outbursts. Decades in the military had taught him to keep his emotions in check, but the weight of Elaine's labored breathing from the night before pressed against his ribs. "This isn't some suspicious wire transfer," he said, his tone measured but firm. "This is my pension. I've been getting it for decades. My wife needs her medication today." Travis shrugged, a small, indifferent gesture that felt like a slap. "I understand, sir, I really do. But I'm not authorized to bypass system locks." His words were hollow, a rehearsed line delivered without conviction. He gestured toward the pamphlet again, as if it held all the answers Walter needed. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he touched the brochure, not picking it up, but letting his fingers rest on its smooth surface. He didn't want to raise his voice or cause a scene. That wasn't his way. But the image of Elaine, pale and wheezing in their worn armchair, flashed in his mind. The new inhaler wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between her breathing and not. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, and leaned forward slightly. "My wife," he said, his voice low but laced with a quiet intensity, "has advanced lung disease. Her doctor prescribed a new inhaler. It cost nearly $400 up front. I'm not asking for a loan. I'm asking for my money." For the first time, Travis looked up, but only for a fleeting moment. His expression remained blank, as if he'd been trained to deflect emotion, to let it slide off like rain on a windshield. "I understand your concerns, sir," he said, his voice as flat as before. "But the system locked the account due to a security flag. It's bank policy. There's nothing I can do from this terminal." Walter's jaw tightened. "Bank policy?" he echoed, the words tasting bitter. Travis nodded, already shifting his attention to the next screen, as if Walter's problem was just a glitch to be dismissed. "You're welcome to wait for the hold to shift," Travis added. "It usually clears within 48 business hours." 48 business hours? Walter's voice tightened, a rare edge breaking through his calm. "That could mean 4 days. She doesn't have 4 days." "I'm sorry," Travis said, the words automatic, devoid of any real regret. He gestured toward the waiting area, a row of stiff chairs under harsh fluorescent lights. "You can sit over there if you'd like." Walter didn't move. His hands remained on the counter, anchoring him as his mind raced. The system didn't care about the years he'd spent in uniform, the sacrifices he'd made, or the quiet terror of watching Elaine struggle for every breath. And Travis, with his cold efficiency, didn't care either. The pamphlet lay between them, a flimsy barrier separating Walter's reality from the bank's sterile policies. Inside, a storm of frustration and fear churned, but Walter kept it contained, his discipline holding firm. He wouldn't beg, he wouldn't shout, but he also wouldn't walk away, not when Elaine's life hung in the balance. Walter stood before the bank counter, his weathered hands resting lightly on the cold, polished surface. The clerk, Travis, barely looked up from his screen, his voice flat and rehearsed. "There's a helpline you can call, if you'd like. I'm afraid that's all I can offer." The words hung in the air, sterile and unyielding, like the fluorescent lights overhead. Walter's chest tightened, but he didn't let his frustration boil over. No raised voice, no fist slamming the counter, no demand for a supervisor. Instead, he drew a slow, deliberate breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling with the weight of resignation. He nodded once, not in agreement with Travis, but in quiet acknowledgement of the truth he'd come to know too well. No one here was going to help him. He turned away, his boots scuffing softly against the gleaming tile floor, which felt colder than it should, as if it were leaching the warmth from his body. Each step toward the bench by the entrance felt heavier than the last, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He sank onto the bench, elbows propped on his knees, his calloused hands loosely clasped. For a long moment he was still, staring down at the glossy brochure Travis had handed him. Its bright colors and tiny font seemed almost mocking, too cheerful for a man whose world was unraveling. He could already imagine the labyrinth of automated phone menus, the tinny hold music, the inevitable transfer to an overworked representative reading from a script. Policy had long since replaced humanity in places like this, and Walter knew it. His thoughts drifted to Elaine, and a pang of guilt twisted in his gut. He could see her so clearly, her frail frame propped against the pillows, her thin shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath. Her voice, soft and worn, carried that familiar "we" in every sentence, a reminder of the life they'd built together. Her eyes, though tired, had held a quiet trust when she'd asked him that morning, "Will you be able to get my medication today?" The question wasn't just about medicine. It was about the promise he'd made to her decades ago, to always be there to make things right. Now, sitting in this sterile bank lobby, he felt that promise slipping through his fingers. Walter closed his eyes, and a memory stirred, faint at first, like a whisper from another life. A name, a number. It had been years, more than a decade, maybe closer to 15, since he'd thought of it. Back then, Walter had been a senior master sergeant, working logistics for a national disaster protocol team, part of a joint civilian-military emergency response initiative called Crimson Watch. He'd been in his element, orchestrating supply chains and coordinating resources with a precision that earned him respect. During one of those simulations, a junior officer had handed him a business card, his voice low and serious. "If the system ever fails someone, it's meant to protect. Call this number. It's a direct line. Last resort only." Walter had chuckled at the time, tucking the card into his notebook with little thought. It had seemed like a formality, a gesture from a young officer trying to make an impression, but he'd kept it, more out of habit than expectation. Now, in the suffocating silence of the bank lobby, surrounded by the indifference of bureaucracy, Walter reached into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed against the familiar weight of his old flip phone, scratched, outdated but dependable, much like the man who carried it. He opened his worn leather wallet, its edges frayed from years of use, and sifted through a sleeve of grocery receipts and folded notes. Tucked behind them was the card, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Graham Kesler, Emergency Liaison, Treasury and Infrastructure Task Force. The name brought a flood of memories, long days spent in conference rooms, mapping out disaster scenarios. Graham's sharp mind cutting through the chaos with calm precision. He'd been young then, a financial analyst with a quiet intensity, his eyes missing nothing. Despite their age difference, Walter had liked him. They'd shared a mutual respect, a belief in the mission and in doing things right. Walter's thumb hovered over the phone's keypad, doubt creeping in like a shadow. People like Graham didn't answer unknown numbers anymore. Men like him, high-ranking, insulated by layers of assistants and gatekeepers, were unreachable. What was he even doing clinging to a 15-year-old promise? And yet something deeper stirred in Walter, a stubborn resolve that had carried him through decades of service and countless crises. This wasn't about a favor. This was about Elaine, about the life they'd built, about the system that was failing her when she needed it most. He dialed. To his shock, the call didn't even ring twice. "Kesler," came the voice on the other end, crisp and commanding, yet carrying the same calm authority Walter remembered. His breath caught, and for a moment he felt the years collapse, as if they were back in that conference room, strategizing over coffee and maps. "Graham, it's Walter. Walter Briggs, Senior Master Sergeant, retired. We served together during the Crimson Watch. You gave me a number, said to call if the system ever—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. The words felt inadequate for the weight of the moment. A pause stretched across the line, then Graham's voice softened, recognition breaking through. "Walter Briggs, good Lord, it's been, what, 15 years? Are you all right?" Walter exhaled, realizing only then how tightly he'd been holding his breath. The sound of Graham's voice, steady and familiar, was like a lifeline in the sterile void of the lobby. "I wouldn't be calling if I were," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm sitting in the lobby of New Liberty Bank. My pension came in this morning, same as it has for decades. But they froze my account. Some system-wide update, they say. My wife's medication is waiting at the pharmacy, and they won't release the funds. Elaine, yeah, she's not well, Graham. I don't know what else to do." Walter's voice didn't waver, but inside his heart was a storm of worry and frustration. He thought of Elaine's tired smile, the way she'd squeezed his hand that morning, trusting him to make this right. He thought of the years they'd spent together, the promises kept through hard times, the quiet moments that had stitched their lives into one. And now here he was, reduced to a stranger in a system that didn't care, clutching a faded business card as his last hope. On the other end of the line, Graham listened, his silence heavy with understanding. Walter could almost picture him, still sharp-eyed, still weighing every word. The man he'd known all those years ago hadn't been one for empty promises. Graham had believed in the system, but he'd also known its flaws, its blind spots. That's why he'd given Walter the card, why he'd said, "Only if it really matters." And this, Walter knew, mattered more than anything. Walter sat in the bank's lobby, his elbows heavy on his knees, his gaze locked on the glossy floor tiles that mirrored the cold, sterile glow of the overhead lights. Time dragged, each second stretching into an eternity, as if the world itself were holding its breath alongside him. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, not just the frustration of a system that had failed him, but the deeper ache of a life spent serving, only to be met with indifference. The bank buzzed with the hum of ordinary life, the soft chatter of customers, the rhythmic clack of keyboards, the whir of printers spitting out paperwork. To everyone else, it was just another Tuesday. To Walter, it was a quiet unraveling, a private crisis tucked into the corner of a place that should have been his ally. He didn't notice the front doors slide open, but the room did. A sharp hiss cut through the air, followed by the deliberate tap of polished shoes striking tile. The lobby fell silent, as if someone had flipped a switch. Conversations halted mid-sentence, fingers froze above keyboards, and chairs creaked as heads swiveled toward the entrance. Walter lifted his eyes, slow and deliberate, to find Graham Kesler framed in the doorway like a storm cloud rolling across a clear sky. Graham hadn't changed much in the years since Walter last saw him, though time had sharpened his edges. His face, once boyishly determined, now carried the weight of authority, not the kind granted by a title, but the kind forged in the crucible of hard choices. His tailored dark suit hugged his frame with precision, every seam exuding command. But it was his expression that seized the room. Fury, cold and tightly coiled, like a predator sizing up its prey. Graham's sharp eyes swept the lobby, locking onto Walter with the precision of a missile. He crossed the room in long, purposeful strides, extending a hand as he approached. "Walter," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of sincerity and regret. "It's good to see you. though I'd give anything for it to be under better circumstances. Walter rose, his movements stiff but steady, and clasped Graham's hand. The handshake was firm, grounding, a silent acknowledgement of shared history. Didn't expect to call in that favor, Walter said, his voice rough with the strain of the day. Graham's lips twitched in a tight, humorless nod. You didn't. You just reminded me what this place is supposed to stand for. Without another word, Graham turned toward the counter, his presence shifting the air in the room. Where's the branch manager? His voice rose just enough to cut through the silence. Not a shout, but a command that snapped through the lobby like a flag caught in a gust. Travis, the young teller behind the counter, froze, his fingers hovering over his keyboard as if afraid to touch it. She's in a meeting, I think, he stammered, his face paling under the weight of Graham's gaze. Then interrupt it, Graham said, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. Now. Travis blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Yes, sir, I'll go get her. Don't bother, Graham cut in, already moving toward a door marked Manager, Authorized Personnel Only. Behind him trailed a sharply dressed woman clutching a clipboard, likely his executive assistant, her expression a mask of quiet efficiency, and a tall, broad man in a black suit who looked less like a banker and more like a wall of muscle masquerading as one. The trio moved with purpose, a small but formidable entourage that seemed to pull the room's gravity toward them. As if summoned by the sheer force of Graham's presence, Ms. Delaney emerged from a hallway, her eyes widening as she registered the CEO of the parent corporation striding toward her. Mr. Kesler, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of surprise and dread. I wasn't expecting— You weren't, Graham interrupted, his tone as cold as the tile beneath his feet. And neither was your staff, apparently, because your team just denied a military veteran access to his federally deposited pension for medical needs due to an improperly coded security flag and did nothing to fix it. His words landed like a gavel, precise and unyielding. Ms. Delaney blinked, her composure crumbling. I only just got back, she managed. But Graham didn't wait for excuses. Office, now, bring the teller and Mr. Briggs. The next 5 minutes unfolded like a scene from a courtroom drama, charged with tension that seemed to hum in the air. Inside the manager's office, Graham stood, his presence filling the room without the need for a chair. Ms. Delaney hovered awkwardly behind her desk, her fingers twisting nervously as she tried to maintain some semblance of authority. Travis lingered by the door, pale and sweating, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape. Walter stood off to the side, his posture ramrod straight, a silent sentinel whose quiet dignity spoke louder than any outburst could. Graham's voice, when he began, was slow and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence, every eye fixed on him, every breath held in anticipation. Walter watched, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. The system had failed him, yes, but in this moment, one man stood ready to fight for what was right. For Walter, it was enough to keep the flicker of hope alive, even as the world outside continued its indifferent hum. On a crisp morning, Walter Briggs, a man whose weathered hands bore the silent scars of 3 decades of military service, stepped into the local branch of Liberty Corp Bank. His purpose was simple yet urgent: to withdraw a portion of his hard-earned pension to cover the cost of his wife Elaine's medication. Each step he took carried the weight of a lifetime dedicated to his country, his quiet dignity a testament to years spent in uniform. But as he stood at the counter, his request was met with an unexpected barrier, an automated system flag that froze his account. Confusion flickered in his eyes, quickly giving way to a quiet, simmering frustration as he explained the urgency of his need. Elaine's health depended on those funds, and time was not a luxury they could afford. Instead of a solution, he was handed a glossy brochure, its pages filled with hollow promises and corporate jargon. The gesture felt like a dismissal, a cold reminder that the system he had fought for sometimes failed to fight for him. Behind the counter, Travis, a young teller with only a few months on the job, felt his stomach twist. He wanted to help, but the screen before him flashed unyielding red warnings, and the training manual he clung to offered no answers. It's policy, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced nervously at Walter. The words felt inadequate even as they left his lips. Travis knew the man before him deserved better, but the rigid protocols he'd been taught left no room for flexibility. His inexperience weighed heavily on him, a gnawing sense of inadequacy settling in as he realized he didn't know how to escalate the issue. He followed the script, as he'd been trained, but the script hadn't prepared him for the quiet pain in Walter's eyes or the urgency of a veteran's plea. Miss Delaney, the branch manager, stood nearby, her arms crossed and her confidence faltering. She prided herself on running a tight ship, but the weight of the moment pressed against her chest. When Graham Kesler, the CEO of Liberty Corp, entered the branch, his presence was like a storm rolling in, calm but commanding, with an intensity that demanded accountability. His sharp gaze settled on Travis first. "Is it true you couldn't override the hold?" he asked, his tone steady but piercing. Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. I followed policy. I didn't know how to escalate it." The admission felt like a confession, and Travis's cheeks burned with shame. He wanted to explain, to say he was new, that he was trying, but the words caught in his throat under Graham's scrutiny. Graham's attention shifted to Miss Delaney, his eyes narrowing as he referenced Directive 7B, Paragraph 4, the protocol outlining escalation procedures for veteran pension accounts. Miss Delaney's heart sank. She prided herself on her attention to detail, but that specific directive felt like a distant memory, buried under the avalanche of daily operations. I don't recall that section specifically," she admitted, her voice trembling. The words felt like a betrayal of her own competence. She had always seen herself as a capable leader, but now, standing before a man like Walter Briggs, she felt the sting of her own shortcomings. Graham's response was swift and unyielding. "Then you failed in your duty," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "You are the gatekeeper of this branch. When your staff can't help a man like Mr. Briggs, who has given more to this country than most of us ever will, this bank fails, not just in service, but in humanity." The words landed like a blow, and Miss Delaney's composure wavered. She thought of the countless hours she'd spent ensuring compliance, training her team, and meeting corporate metrics. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. She had failed Walter, and the weight of that failure settled deep in her chest. She wanted to apologize, to make it right, but the opportunity to act had passed her by. Graham turned to Walter, his demeanor softening but still resolute. "Mr. Briggs, your funds are available immediately. I've removed the hold myself." His voice carried a quiet authority, but it was his next words that struck a deeper chord. "The cost of your wife's medication, not just today, but for the next 12 months, will be covered by my discretionary account. It's the least we can do." Walter's lips parted, his stoic facade cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of disbelief and gratitude. "You didn't have to," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. For a man who had faced war and sacrifice, the gesture felt like an acknowledgement of his worth, a rare moment of justice in a world that often overlooked him. "I absolutely did," Graham replied, his tone unwavering. "This is what happens when people hide behind procedure instead of stepping up." As Graham issued directives, his authority transformed the room. With a few phone calls, he ensured Walter's account was not only unfrozen but flagged as a veteran priority, a red banner across the system proclaiming immediate access authorized by CEO. Miss Delaney, still reeling from her own lapse, took it upon herself to process the withdrawal slip. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet resolve to make amends. Standing across the counter, she handed Walter the slip, her voice softer now, tinged with genuine remorse. "I've processed your withdrawal, Mr. Briggs. I sincerely apologize for this morning. We'll ensure this never happens again." Walter offered a quiet nod, his silence speaking volumes. He had no need for words. His service, his sacrifice had already said enough. The burden of failure now rested with those who had let him down. Graham stepped to Walter's side, his presence a steady anchor. "I meant what I said," he told him, his voice firm yet warm. "Elaine's medication costs are covered for the next 12 months. I've assigned someone from my executive office to handle it personally. No more automated lines or brochures." Walter raised an eyebrow, a spark of surprise breaking through his reserved demeanor. "That's generous," he said, his voice steady but laced with appreciation. Graham nodded once. "It's justice, and it's long overdue." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, their shared understanding transcending words. Both were soldiers in their own right. Graham from a different era, a different war, but bound to Walter by a mutual respect for what it meant to serve, to earn something through sacrifice rather than entitlement. By the end of the day, the story of Walter Briggs and Graham Kesler had rippled beyond the branch. Whispers of the encounter spread through Liberty Corp's network, carried by employees who felt both inspired and chastened. An internal memo signed by Graham himself landed in every manager's inbox. Its subject line was stark. "Veterans are not just customers, they are commitments." The message was even more direct. It declared that any failure to serve veteran clients with urgency, to respect, and flexibility would face immediate consequences. "Veterans are not policy problems," it read. "They are the reason this company exists in the country we call home. Any system that cannot adapt to their needs is a system that must be restructured." The words sparked a wave of action. Staff meetings were called, and emergency retraining modules were rolled out across the network. For Walter, though, the victory was personal. He left the bank not just with the funds he needed, but with a renewed sense of being seen, valued, and respected for the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. The directive landed in the inboxes of branch managers nationwide. A weighty email with the subject line, Size 7B, Veteran Priority Response, Recognition, Escalation, and Resolution. It wasn't a suggestion, but a mandate, a ripple effect from a single incident that had stirred something deep within the corporate machinery of Liberty Corp. For Travis, the young teller who had stood behind the counter that day, the email marked the beginning of a reckoning. He wasn't being fired, nor was he being publicly shamed, but the internal review he now faced felt like a spotlight on his every misstep. His heart sank as he read the notice, a mix of dread and confusion swirling in his chest. He'd followed protocol, hadn't he? He'd stuck to the script, the one drilled into him during training. But the review wasn't about punishment. It was about teaching him something enduring, how to truly listen, how to shoulder responsibility, and how to see the human being beyond the paperwork. Sent home for 2 weeks, Travis was also enrolled in a mentorship program under a senior advisor, a grizzled Navy veteran whose stern gaze and measured words carried the weight of experience. Travis felt small, not just in stature but in understanding, as he began to grapple with the lesson that some rules were meant to bend when humanity was at stake. Ms. Delaney, the branch manager who had dismissed Walter's pleas with a practiced smile, faced her own consequences. The news of her reassignment hit her like a cold wave. Executive retraining wasn't a demotion, not technically, but it stung all the same. She was to join Liberty Corp's newly formed Veteran Liaison Department, a role that would force her to work directly with vulnerable clients, people like Walter, whose quiet dignity she'd overlooked. As she packed her office belongings, her mind churned with a mix of resentment and unease. Hadn't she done her job? Followed the bank's policies to the letter? Yet deep down, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. She'd seen the exhaustion in Walter's eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he explained his situation. But she'd chosen efficiency over empathy. Now, as she prepared to step into this new role, she felt the weight of her own shortcomings, a realization that left her both defensive and determined to prove she could do better. Walter, the man at the center of it all, hadn't asked for any of this upheaval. He didn't revel in the changes his complaint had sparked, nor did he linger on the victory of it. That afternoon, he walked out of the bank with $400 in his pocket, enough to cover the medication Elaine so desperately needed. The city bus rumbled beneath him as he rode home, the weight of the day settling into his bones. In his left hand, he clutched a small, white pharmacy bag, its contents unremarkable to anyone else but monumental to him. It held Elaine's new medication, a lifeline for the woman who had been his anchor for over 4 decades. The sun was setting as he stepped off the bus, casting a golden glow across the cracked sidewalks of their modest neighborhood. A chill hung in the air, the first whisper of winter, but Walter barely noticed. His mind was still replaying the day, the quiet humiliation of being dismissed at the bank, the helpless frustration of sitting in that sterile lobby, The unexpected power of a single phone call to Graham Kesler, a man high enough in the world to make things happen. The emotions churned softly within him, not anger but a kind of weary resolve. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, each step deliberate, his legs tired but unyielding. The day had been long, not in hours, but in the toll it took on his spirit. Inside, the apartment was as he'd left it, tidy, unassuming, a sanctuary of routine. Elaine sat in her worn armchair by the window, a blanket draped over her thin legs, the faint hiss of her oxygen tube filling the quiet. Her eyes, sharp despite her frailty, flicked to the bag in his hand the moment he'd crossed the threshold. "You got it?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with hope. Walter nodded, crossing the room to place the bag gently in her hands. "I got it," he said, his tone steady, reassuring. Elaine didn't smile, not the wide, radiant kind she used to give him in their younger years. Her strength had been sapped by illness, but her eyes glowed with a quiet relief that spoke louder than any grin. Walter felt it deep in his chest, a warmth that eased the ache of the day. They didn't need many words. They never had. "What happened at the bank?" she asked after a pause, curiosity flickering in her voice, though it carried no trace of worry. Walter hesitated, his mind sifting through the ordeal, the dismissive teller, the unyielding manager, the sudden shift when his call to Kesler turned the tide. "They made it right," he said simply, and that was enough. Elaine didn't press. After 42 years together, she knew when to let silence carry the weight of what wasn't said. That evening, they shared a modest dinner, the kind of meal that spoke of love more than abundance. Elaine took her first dose of the new medication, and for the first time in days, she drifted into sleep without the racking cough that had haunted her nights. Walter sat beside her, his eyes tracing the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. In that rhythm, he found a fragile peace, a moment of calm in a world that too often felt unsteady. He didn't sleep much himself, his mind too full, but he didn't mind. Watching her rest was enough. The next morning, Walter rose early, as was his habit. He brewed coffee in their chip pot, the familiar ritual grounding him. Sitting at the kitchen table, he unfolded the newspaper and scanned the headlines, his eyes catching on a small article on a business news site. Liberty Corp launches Veteran Priority Access Program after CEO responds to mishandled case. The words unfolded a story he hadn't expected to see in print. The bank had rolled out a new policy across every branch, a direct hotline for veteran clients, faster escalation protocols, and mandatory training for staff on handling federal disbursements like pensions and benefits. By the end of the quarter, every employee would complete a course in veteran sensitivity and emergency response. No names were mentioned, no spotlight shone on Walter Briggs, and that suited him just fine. He hadn't fought for recognition or headlines. All he'd wanted was to take care of Elaine by Wayne to ensure the system saw his service, in the service of countless others. Not as a number in a file, but as a life, a story, a promise kept. As he sipped his coffee, the steam curling from his chipped mug, Walter's thoughts drifted. He wasn't naive. He knew not every veteran had a Graham Kesler to call, someone with the clout to shake the system awake. That truth sat heavy on his heart. The changes at Liberty Corp were a start, but they were just that, a start. For now, though, he let himself sit in the quiet victory of the moment. The medication was in Elaine's hands, her breathing was steady, and the world, for one morning, felt a little more just. He turned the page of the newspaper, the weight of the day before easing just a fraction, and let the warmth of the coffee seep into his hands. Walter Briggs stood at the counter, his weathered hands resting lightly on the polished surface, fingers tracing the edge, as if grounding himself in a world that felt increasingly foreign. His eyes, sharp despite the years etched into his face, held a quiet resolve. But beneath that calm exterior churned a storm of frustration and disbelief. How many times had he been here before, not just at this bank, but in countless other places, facing the same impersonal wall of policy and procedure? How many others, like him, had stood in similar lines, their stories reduced to numbers on a screen, their urgency dismissed by a system that prioritized efficiency over empathy? Walter, a veteran who had given decades of his life to his country, felt the weight of being rendered invisible. It wasn't just about the frozen bank account or the medication he couldn't access in time. It was about the deeper wound, wound, the sense that his sacrifices, his very existence, could be so easily brushed aside by someone reading from a script, their voice flat, their eyes avoiding his. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand special treatment. Walter's strength lay in his quiet dignity, a presence that carried the weight of a life lived with purpose. Yet as he stood there, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this moment wasn't unique, he couldn't help but wonder about the others. How many had walked away from counters like this one, their heads bowed, their spirits bruised? How many had been told, there's nothing we can do, and left feeling unworthy of urgency, as if their needs were a mere inconvenience to the machine of progress? The thought gnawed at him, not just for himself, but for every person who had been made to feel small by a system that forgot the human heart beating at its core. Across the counter, the young bank teller, barely out of her 20s, shifted uncomfortably. Her name tag read Emily, and her eyes darted between the computer screen and the man before her. She wasn't unkind, but she was trapped in a role that demanded she follow the rules, no matter how rigid or cold they seemed. Inside, she felt a pang of guilt. Walter's steady gaze made her want to look away, to hide from the humanity in his eyes. She could sense the weight of his story, even if she didn't know the details. She thought of her own grandfather, a man who rarely spoke of his time in the service, but whose hands trembled when he recounted the friends he'd lost. Emily wanted to help, but the system she worked within offered no flexibility. The policies were clear, the procedures unyielding, and her training had drilled into her that stepping outside those lines could cost her job. Still, as she repeated the scripted response, "I'm sorry, sir, but your account is frozen due to a flagged transaction," she felt a knot tighten in her chest. She wasn't just denying Walter. She was denying the part of herself that wanted to do more, to be more than a key in a machine. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't born of anger or confrontation. It was Walter's simple refusal to accept that this was the end of the conversation. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm, and asked, "Is there someone who can make this right?" It wasn't a demand, but a plea wrapped in resolve, a reminder that systems, for all their automation and structure, were still run by people, and people could choose to listen. People could choose to care. That small act of standing his ground sparked something, a ripple that would grow beyond that moment, beyond that counter. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start, a quiet rebellion against a system that had forgotten what it meant to serve. For Walter, it wasn't just about getting his account unfrozen or securing his medication. It was about reclaiming a sense of worth in a world that too often dismissed people like him. Older adults, veterans, those who had built the very foundation of the society now moving too fast to notice them. He thought of the men he'd served with, the ones who never made it home, and the ones who did but now faced battles of a different kind, battles against bureaucracy, indifference, and time itself. The system's failure wasn't just a personal slight, it was a betrayal of the promises made to those who had given everything. Walter's heart ached not just for himself, but for every person who had been told their needs didn't matter. Their stories didn't count. Emily, too, felt the weight of that moment. As she called for her manager, her mind raced. She thought about how easy it was to hide behind policies, to let the system dictate her actions. But Walter's quiet insistence made her question that ease. What did it mean to serve, really? Was it just following the rules? Or was it something more? Something that required her to see the person in front of her, not just the problem on her screen. She felt a flicker of hope, a desire to be part of something better, even if it meant stepping out of her comfort zone. She didn't know Walter's full story, but she could feel the depth of his struggle, and it stirred something in her. A longing to bridge the gap between the system's cold efficiency and the warmth of human connection. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a frozen bank account or a delayed prescription. It was about the deeper truth of how easily systems built for convenience can lose sight of compassion. It was about the sting of being told there's nothing we can do by someone following a script when you've given your life to a cause greater than yourself. Walter's quiet dignity spoke louder than any protest could. He reminded everyone in that bank and beyond of a lesson too often forgotten in a world obsessed with speed and technology. True respect is shown not in grand gestures, but in how we treat people at their most vulnerable. His stand wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had been made to feel invisible, every soul dismissed by a system that valued efficiency over empathy. In modern America, where technology, policy, and speed dominate, it's easy to lose sight of what matters most. When those things replace compassion, we risk losing something far more valuable: the humanity that binds us. This is especially true for those like Walter, the older adults and veterans whose sacrifices laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit. His story is a call to remember that systems, no matter how advanced, are still shaped by people. And sometimes it takes just one person standing up, one man refusing to accept no as the final answer, to remind us all what it means to truly serve.